Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Romali here with the Hurricane Season 2020 update, part of the Hurricane Outlook and Assessment for July 24th, 2020, recorded around 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. This is the first of two video updates for today. First of all, starting over here in the Central Pacific Basin, we have Major Hurricane Douglas, now a Category 4 hurricane, maximum sustained winds of 130 miles per hour, pressure down to 954 millibars. This is expected to now undergo a weakening trend and is already starting to. We'll take a look at that here in a minute. This is now starting to undergo a weakening trend as it approaches the Hawaiian Islands over here. However, this is still expected to be a hurricane by the time it gets near the Hawaiian Islands, as it now starts to make that turn then back towards the northwest here. This is on a direct beeline for the Hawaiian Islands. Reconnaissance aircraft missions will begin into Douglas later today. And this will get a better estimate on what is going on with our system right now in the Central Pacific Basin. But take a look here at the IR satellite loop. You notice how we have this dry, stable air over here in cooler waters, and conversely, the cloud tops now associated with Douglas are not as deep. You notice that this is fairly weak, anemic convection. The overall eye structure has degraded with, still a little bit of an eye present, but it's significantly degraded. So this is rapidly now undergoing a weakening trend as it approaches the cooler waters out here. But for those visitors and residents in Hawaii, what you can expect is obviously some strong winds, heavy rainfall, flooding, especially on the upslope side of the islands. This is going to cause some flooding. The orographic lift is going to cause these thunderstorms to build up even more. It's going to cause some of the outer bands to be a little bit more intense. They cause more rainfall, mudslides, strong winds, that sort of thing. A Category 1 hurricane is going to bring some storm surge. So for those folks out here, residents and visitors in the Hawaiian Islands, make sure to stay and pay attention to the local official forecasts from your local National Weather Service office over there in Honolulu, Hawaii, and also for the official Central Pacific Hurricane Center forecast, as this continues to approach Hawaii here rapidly and should be in the Hawaiian Islands here over the next 60 hours or so. So make sure you guys pay attention to that and take all the necessary precautions, as this could be a fairly significant storm to impact the Hawaiian Islands over the next few days into this weekend. Now, taking a look here back at the Atlantic Basin, we're taking a look here at Tropical Storm Hanna. This became a tropical storm last night. Reconnaissance aircraft did find that pressures have dropped to about 1,001 millibars this morning and winds up to about 40 miles per hour, making this Tropical Storm Hanna. Tropical storm warnings have been extended all the way down to near McAllen, Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, with tropical storm watches all the way up to near Houston, Texas. This is expected to come in at a little bit lower trajectory. So for you folks over there in Houston, this is going to be a bigger storm, but in terms of the actual core and center of this storm, you guys are not expected to get that center. However, this is a fairly large system, as we'll take a look here in a minute, and this could bring still some impacts even as far to the portions of the Louisiana coastline over the next few days or so. Sustained winds are now expected to be about 65 miles per hour right before landfall, and this is one of the things that we talked about yesterday, that you guys need to have your hurricane preparedness plans ready, because now all of a sudden going from 45 miles per hour to 50, now to 65 right before a landfall, and models are starting to pick up that this could even be a hurricane upon landfall. Trends are your best friend today, and if this does continue to be stronger today, hurricane watches and warnings will be needed for portions of the Texas coastline by this afternoon and evening. But again, this is expected to approach the coastline here within the next 24 to 36 hours or so. Right now, it's still sitting roughly about south of New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole, moving due west here. Eventually, this is going to come in and make a bend back towards the west here, and then eventually west-southwest into Mexico as this moves inland. But again, the main impacts today, or the main impacts to be expected: gusty winds, storm surge, heavy rain, coastal flooding, that deal, even inland flooding, because this is going to slow down just enough that this could produce some inland flooding for those areas. So certainly something that you have to be mindful of. If we take a look here at the IR satellite presentation, because the sun's not quite up on this system quite yet, so we don't get visible satellite right now, but we do get an IR satellite presentation showing very vigorous thunderstorms with cloud tops now approaching 80 to 85 degrees Celsius or negative 80 to 85 degrees Celsius, so very cold cloud tops out here associated with Hanna. You notice there is more of this banding semi-structure that's going on today, and we almost saw this with Gonzalo yesterday morning, very early in the morning yesterday, before this kind of took a big gulp of dry air. Well, you're now starting to see this with Hanna, suggesting a lower level center is now becoming a more dominant feature here. And this semi-curved banding, if it can wrap all the way around, would suggest that we have a primitive eye wall starting to form. Currently, if I had to take a guess, it would probably be a western eye wall. And if we take a look here at the reconnaissance aircraft that is currently still in the storm, there's the visible satellite now starting to just show up. Again, the reconnaissance aircraft did find a little bit of a 45 knot wind, so that's just about 50 miles per hour. But the overall structure here around the western and northern part of the system is still fairly convectively anemic and does not have the winds to back it at all. So this, and the pressure down to about 1,001 millibars. But what this tells me is that the structure still has a little bit of work to do. You can kind of see where our banding structure is this morning. This still has a lot of work to do if it wants to become a hurricane by today. Again, a lot of this is going to depend on how this semi-curved structure ends up kind of wrapping around. Now, conditions are quite favorable, and this still has about 24 to 36 hours over water, which is more than enough, given that this is already starting to strengthen even further. If you take a look here at the CDAS, sea surface temperatures in this region, valid as of about 8 o'clock last night, again, it's coming from tropicaltidbits.com, by the way. These sea surface temperatures in here are fairly warm, about 30 Celsius in this region. Right up along even the coastline, we're seeing at about 30 Celsius, and that is fairly warm waters. Combined with this is the upper ocean heat content values, again, right up along the coast. You know, these blues, lighter blues and greens, that's not low upper ocean heat content. I mean, that's low on the scale, but in all reality, that's not low. I mean, it's certainly not as high as out here in the Caribbean, which is stifling with it, but this is fairly significant upper ocean heat content even along the coastline. And where this would be coming into right around here is high upper ocean heat content all the way to the shelf waters, which usually in the shelf waters you get a lot of this very light, very dark blue rather, suggesting a low upper ocean heat content values, but that's not the case. So this has all the way up until the coastline to actually strengthen and get it in its act together. So that is fairly concerning, because with the pressures down to 1,001 millibars, we have a nice semi-curved structure this morning. We will have to see how it progresses throughout the day today. Currently, this is not a sign of rapid intensification, but these thunderstorms, with how cold they are, this is promoting surface fluxes in the atmosphere. So for you folks from near McAllen, Texas, all the way up to near Houston, needs to be paying attention, really, especially near the Rio Grande Valley over here to McAllen, Texas, needs to be paying attention, as this could be a little bit stronger of a system, currently stronger than expected, getting close to hurricane intensity as it approaches the coastline. So that is one of the things that we talked about yesterday. You guys need to be ready for that. Now, let's see how that demonstrates here on the H-Wharf model. This is from the 6Z, or about 2 o'clock Eastern time run this morning. And the pressures at about 7 o'clock this morning were about 1,002 millibars. So the H-Wharf is forecasting this pretty nicely. Pressures are only 1 millibar weaker, so this is handling it quite well. And you notice how now that really starts to get its act together down to 994 millibars by later this afternoon. You notice a fairly moist pocket, so we're not dealing with any dry air intrusions across this area. Still not dealing with any dry air intrusions by about 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. Pressure down to 981 millibars. Now, there's a couple things that I need to kind of point out here. First of all, this pressure of 981 millibars, is it accurate? Is it completely realistic? I don't really know. And if we take a sounding here, we'll just take a sounding of that vortex, basically, an average area sounding. There is a fairly good amount of instability for these storms to work with. So there is sufficient instability for these storms to work with. Temperature dew point spreads are fairly close all the way up to the top of the tropopause here. So this is fairly indicative that we have a pretty moist atmosphere for the storm to work with. And notice the relative humidity is just about 90% with the equivalent, theta E process here. The theta E values are fairly indicative of one that would favor more storms in the curved hodograph here. Obviously not a curved hodograph in a sense that you're for tornadoes, because this is a tropical system, but this is a fairly well curved hodograph. So 981 millibars, that's seemingly pushing the boundaries of what could happen, but again, you know, given that this is 24 hours out, given that we've seen the structure that it has this morning, you know, then down to 997, I mean, this is one of the things that you really have to look at, even as a forecaster, even as a resident, weather enthusiast, whatever you might be. This is the stuff you have to look at that makes you go, So if you live along the coastline, it doesn't hurt to evacuate. And I'm not saying evacuate, I'm not saying don't evacuate, but it doesn't hurt to take that precaution, because if it does strengthen a little bit more than currently anticipated, you're going to be dealing with storm surge, heavier winds, stuff like that. So for you folks down there, pay close attention to the progress of the system, because you only have another, you know, about 36 hours or so before this makes landfall. Now, conversely, on the HMON model, this is for this morning about 1,005 millibars, so still relatively within the realm of what's going on currently, and that even deepens it down to about 983 millibars right before landfall. So both models are indicating a hurricane on landfall. National Hurricane Center is going with about 65. Might get pushed up. So I'm just saying these are the things you really have to take into consideration. Either way, the biggest threat right now from Tropical Storm Hanna to portions of the Texas coastline and the Rio Grande Valley is going to be heavy rain, certainly about 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. There's some coastal flooding with storm surge and freshwater rainfall, and some squally conditions and and some gusty winds up to about 60 to 70 miles an hour along the coastline as this makes landfall there. Switching gears here out into the Atlantic Basin, we still have Tropical Storm Gonzalo, which is still holding on rather interestingly. Maximum sustained winds still 60 miles per hour with a pressure about 1,000 millibars. This is still expected to become a hurricane, and a couple of things have changed during the day today, which we'll talk about here in a minute. First of all, we have hurricane watches for Barbados and a couple of the island chains down here, tropical storm watches for Trinidad and Tobago down here, and tropical storm warnings further to the north. Over here, St. Lucia to the Grenadines further to the north, and the Windward Islands here in the Lesser Antilles. This is something that you guys need to be taking seriously. Now, whether or not this is, you know, stronger or weaker in through here, it is really kind of hard to say. Currently, the official National Hurricane Center forecast has us becoming a brief Category 1 hurricanes with sustained winds of 75 miles per hour. But here's the thing that I want to point out here, okay? Gradual intensification is expected. So you notice how at 12 hours we're at 65 and 70, and 36 hours we're at hurricane intensity. The difference between 60 and 75 miles per hour is fairly minimal, and you can't really notice that much of a change between 60 and 75 miles an hour, okay? You might be able to notice a little bit of a change, but it's not between 60 and 110 miles per hour, okay? The biggest takeaway right now is that this is a fairly small storm, so it is fairly susceptible to quick changes in intensity both up and down. So yes, this could ramp up pretty quickly, or yes, this could actually fade off pretty quickly and just become an open wave, but it's becoming less likely that that's going to be the option. Again, so the main impacts are going to be heavy rain, not really a lot of storm surge. This isn't really creating that much. It's a fairly small, tightly compacted system, but heavy rain as it scrolls over. Gusty winds, 60, 70 miles an hour, maybe, 75, 80, pushing on the gusts there. As this kind of rolls through Barbados and the Lesser Antilles here. This is probably going to stay to the north here of Trinidad and Tobago. But again, tropical storm watches are in effect for Trinidad and Tobago, just in case if this tries to sneak a little bit more south, which it kind of looked like it was trying to do last night. We'll take a look at that here in a minute. Then this is expected to finally cross into the Caribbean, where it eventually weakens. By 96 hours, this thing is a dissipated cyclone in through here, as in eventually it will probably just cross in through Central America and not really be of any concern, and maybe some leftover remnants making it into the eastern Pacific Basin over the next week or so. Now, if you take a look here at the IR satellite presentation from tropicaltidbits.com, a couple of things to note here. First of all, we have had a lot more sustained deep convection around the center last night. Now, if you roll this forward just a little bit, this is from about a couple of hours ago. This is about an hour and a half ago. And you see a couple of things starting to happen here. First of all, we have some dry air, and that's been the problem. You notice all of this very dry, stable air that is kind of squashing any thunderstorm development to the north of this system, and you kind of notice how that's been just traversing the area for a little bit here. Second of all, if we back this up just a little bit, you notice what also happened. We had a convective outflow boundary right here, and you kind of notice the, structure of these thunderstorms over on the western side of the system. Now, you notice this area is still relatively enveloped in some deeper convection right around the center of circulation. It just went and undergone and undergo another cycle of deep convective pulses here. But you notice that this area is fairly convectively anemic in through this western side, the southern side, no convection to speak of, the northern side, barely anything to speak of. If you take a look here at the visible satellite loop, well, you kind of get the idea that we had kind of this outflow boundary because this dry air is causing these thunderstorms to collapse over here. It's causing an outflow boundary to race away from the storm. And you notice some of these arc-like clouds out here suggesting all of this dry air from storms that are trying to develop and just can't do it. And that's causing outflow boundaries galore to form. There's, outflow boundaries here, a big one here. So there's a lot of outflow boundaries. And if we go closer in here from the Weather Nerd site, we just kind of update the plot here. It's a really great site, by the way. And we just kind of stop this here. A couple of things to note. This is from just about 10 minutes ago. And you notice we have a fairly deep convective pulse right near the center of circulation here, with cloud tops approaching about negative 80 to negative 85 degrees Celsius cloud tops over here. So fairly cold cloud tops in general across this whole area. So this is a small central dense overcast once again. We have seen last night that we tried to get some rotation in some of these hot towers, and that's just maybe somewhat of a inner core that is trying to rebuild once again. However, again, dry air intrusions are going to be the biggest problem. Now, we do have recon that is going to, aircraft reconnaissance that's going to go in later this afternoon to investigate the structure of Gonzalo as this continues to move towards the west-northwest here. Now, you also notice one other thing is that this is a pretty low latitude. This is about 10 north latitude right here. And again, that is south of 10 latitudes. So, this might try to sneak a little bit south here, and that's why there is tropical storm watches. If we go back here, that's why we have tropical storm watches for Trinidad and Tobago, while we have hurricane watches for Barbados, tropical storm watches to the north, St. Lucia, the Grenadines under hurricane watches as well. This does have a little bit of an inner core structure today, and if it can maintain itself with these deep convective pulses and not get sucked into any dry air, it would have a chance to become a brief hurricane. I say brief because it's probably not going to live that much. And if we take a look here at the 850 millibar relative vorticity here from the Central University of Wisconsin-Madison site, basically the higher you go up in the scale, the reds and whites are higher in stronger cyclonic vorticity. This is actually a little system right here. It doesn't look well here on the product, but because this is a very small system, it has a very tight little inner core structure in through here. And that's the islands of Trinidad and Tobago right there. This is the islands out here. So, You know, this is trying to stay pretty well to the south, and it might just kind of come far enough south that it impacts Trinidad and Tobago, which is going to be one of the more intriguing things. So during the day today, if you live in Trinidad and Tobago, you guys need to start paying attention. Anywhere along the islands now, basically from Barbados, St. Lucia, the Grenadines, Trinidad, and Tobago, need to be paying attention to the progress of Tropical Storm Gonzalo. It does look a little bit better defined this morning, and this could still make a run at being in hurricane intensity by the time it reaches the islands. One of the things that's kind of suggesting that we have very light shear, about 10 to 15 knots of shear, so fairly dry or fairly light shear. Shear is expected to increase significantly once it approaches the islands, 20 to 25 knots here. But the sea surface temperatures in this area where the storm is going to be heading, roughly about 29-30 Celsius, with that deep upper ocean heat content, this is going to be a problem. If you take a look here at the GFS forecast, with the 700 to 400 millibar relative humidity, this is higher up in the atmosphere. This is valid as of 7 a.m. this morning. Pressure is about 996 millibars, so a couple millibars lower. But you notice what ends up happening. This ends up deepening once again to about 994 millibars, relatively encompassed within its own relative pocket through here. But you notice that dry, stable air lurking to its north. This eventually comes over the islands and then starts to weaken out by the time, because we get some dry air coming off of Central America and South America there, and we also get this dry air. This is kind of part of that trade and Saharan air surge, but you also notice that the trade winds now are picking up here to about 10 to 15 to 20 knots across that area, and a smaller system has a fairly hard time, because what's going to end up happening is that mid-level center wants to decouple from the low-level center. The mid-level center wants to go northwest, while the mid-level or the low-level center wants to go westernly here. That ends up decoupling the storm, and that will probably end up shearing and tearing the storm apart. And as such, the GFS forecast really shows us becoming an open wave after hour 66 here on Monday, with a storm relatively weakening out here in the deep tropics. Conversely, if you go, if you go to the European, this is still intensifying this a little bit on approach into the island, staying south of Barbados. But again, if you live anywhere from Barbados, St. Lucia, the Grenadines, southward, Trinidad and Tobago, you guys need to be paying close attention to the progress of this. You also notice that we end up getting a tropical storm Hanna to come in here and make landfall. But eventually, this ends up deep weakening after 120 hours. And you notice, guess what else happens now? Another wave that the National Hurricane Center is monitoring is now trying to develop out here to the east of the Lesser Antilles. So we will be watching this system fairly closely, because this has a fairly significant model support right now for development over the next few days or so. If we take a look here at what's going on in the H-Wharf model, this is basically what's going on for the H-Wharf model here. And again, if you take a look, this is the current structure here, about 999 millibars. This is valid as of about 1 o'clock this morning. You deepen this, again, pressures to 989, fairly unrealistic right now. It's not that deep, but if you do look what happens, it keeps this at about 992 and then re-deepens this down to about 987. So it is theoretically possible that we do have a hurricane on approach to the islands. As you notice, this is a fairly moist pocket enveloped in through here, and then obviously it approaches the island chains here. This is about 996 as it approaches the island chains, so this would be a little bit weaker than on previous runs. And the HMON model, the old GFDL forecast model here, suggesting about 987 millibars. So anywhere between a moderate tropical storm to borderline Category 1 hurricane is possible for the islands here over the next day or so, as this continues to move off towards the west here at about 13 miles per hour. So we do have a lot to watch. Again, first of all, with Tropical Storm Hurricane Douglas, Category 4 weakening now, but expected to be a hurricane on approach to the Hawaiian Islands. So for you folks and for visitors and permanent residents of Hawaii, make sure that you guys stay tuned to the local Weather Service Forecast Office forecasts for Hurricane Douglas. Tropical Storm Hanna formed last night and is trying to get its act together, expected to be closer to hurricane intensity as it approaches the Texas coastline before making landfall near the Rio Grande Valley, just north of McAllen, Texas. And Tropical Tropical Storm Gonzalo expected to still be a hurricane on approach to the Lesser Antilles. Could bring some heavy rain and obviously some gusty winds for those areas before rapidly dissipating in the Caribbean. So a lot to talk about here. Of course, I will be back with another video forecast update roughly around 3 p.m. this afternoon or sooner if needed. Hope you all have a great rest of your morning and early afternoon. I'll see you guys back here then around 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay safe, everyone, and I'll see you in a few hours.